God's instructions are not the way to God. They're the walk with God after you are already in a relationship with Him. And how do you get into a relationship with God? It's exactly the same in the Old Testament as in the New. A faith acceptance of God's gracious offer. Think about it. God comes to Abraham. He says, Abraham, here's the kind of God I am. I'm absolutely right. I'm absolutely true. I'm absolutely pure. I'm absolutely good. And if you will live an absolutely true, absolutely right, absolutely pure, absolutely good life, I'll give you a baby. I'll give you some land. I'll give you a name that will last forever. What about it, Abraham? This building wouldn't exist. There would be no Christian faith. There'd be no Jewish faith. No. God just shows up and He says, I'm going to do these things for you. I know. Old man, old woman, you want a baby. I'm going to do it for you. And I'm going to give you a piece of land that you can have for your own. I'm going to give you a reputation, a blessing to the world forever. What do I have to do? Reach out in faith and take it. See, that's what Paul says in Romans. He says, God didn't start with the Torah. God didn't start with the commandments. God started with grace. It's the same. It's the same with the Hebrew people. There they are in captivity and slavery, making bricks. And God shows up in the person of Moses. And God says, pack your bags. And they say, why? Because you're leaving. Why? Because God's going to take you out of here. Why? Because He loves you. Why? I don't have the foggiest idea. It's grace. Grace. If God had showed up and said to them in their brick pits, now you got to keep all these commandments, and you got to be a good person, and you got to be a kind person, you got to be a true person. And if you do that perfectly for about 400 years, I'll come back and deliver you from Egypt. They'd still be making bricks. Well, if that's true, if the Old Testament is about grace, then why did the Jews miss it? Same reason a lot of us miss it. Because grace is humiliating. You know that. Somebody says, hey, we'd like to have you over for dinner. What's the first thing you say after they're gone? When can we have them over? Somebody does something for you. You really know in your heart of hearts you do not deserve and you cannot repay. It's humiliating. We don't like grace. We want to deserve what we get. We want to labor up the ladder toward heaven and finally pull ourselves over the top and say, God, you didn't think I could do it, did you? But here I am. Would you like to clap? We like that kind of salvation. So we're not a lot different from the Jews. And we can't point a lot of fingers at them and say, well, you stupid people, what did you miss it for? We all miss it. Left to ourselves. Why did the disciples and Paul, why did they see it? Because they had seen it lived out in front of them. That's why. So what's the Torah about then? If the way into God's presence is His grace, if God simply opens the doors of heaven and reaches down and says, honey, take my hand, and we in faith reach out and take His hand, welcome home. If that's what it's about, what in the world are all these commandments about? And I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it again this morning if you weren't in the first service. Jesus, you gave your life for me. You died for me. You loved me to the end. Oh, how can I be like you? How can I walk with you? How can I share your life? And God says, I've got an instruction manual for you. Obedience is not earning our way to heaven through hard, difficult labor. Obedience is a walk of joy that says, since you've given your life for me, I want to give you my life back. The way to obey Torah is not to build a fence around it, but to surrender to God's love and receive a new heart. I took some students to a synagogue some years ago, Hebrew class, and after the service, the rabbi agreed to meet with us and answer some questions. And one of the students really embarrassed me. He was just pushing the rabbi, just pushing him and pushing him. And I kept saying to myself, shut up, shut up, shut up. And I could see the rabbi was getting really exasperated. Finally he said, young man, do you want to know the difference between Judaism and Christianity? The guy sort of gulped and said, yes, please. I'll tell you. Jews believe you go to heaven by prayer and devotion and righteous living. Christians believe you go to heaven by magic. Any other questions? No, sir. No, we don't go to heaven by magic. But it's true, we don't go to heaven by our efforts. Our efforts are a joyous response to the assurance that God has already forgiven us, has already reconciled us to Himself. And again I say, that's not just New Testament. That's Old Testament when you see it in the light of Jesus. So what is the relationship between the Old and the New Testament? If the New Testament doesn't supersede the Old Testament, if it doesn't just correct the Old Testament, if it doesn't replace the Old Testament, what is the relationship between them? Well, at the lowest level, the Old Testament provides the necessary background. Why do we need a cross anyway? What's the matter with us? What's the problem with the human race? What is this justification about? The New Testament writers assume that we know the Old Testament, that we know what the questions are. But the New Testament doesn't contain the Old. It builds on it. And completes it. Some of my colleagues think that I think the Bible ends at Malachi. No, thank God. Because the Old Testament is a book that's incomplete by itself. It's a book of unfulfilled dreams. It's a book of unanswered hopes. Now, if you try to do the New Testament without the Old, it's like trying to build a two-story house starting with the second story. You know, it's really tough to get the boards to stay up there long enough to nail them together. But that's what a lot of Christian faith is. We don't know the questions, so we don't understand the answer. We don't understand the issues, so we don't understand where we're going. But the Old Testament by itself is incomplete. It's a whole book. It's a whole book. And both parts depend on the other part. Now how? How does the New Testament fulfill the Old? It fulfills partial revelation. God shows us some fundamental things about himself and about life and about reality, but he doesn't show us all of it. And so the New Testament fills it out. It fills out those lines and show where they're taking us. The New Testament answers Old Testament questions. If the answer is the cross, what's the question? The question is not how can I have my sins forgiven and go to heaven. The question is how can I share the character of a holy God? If you read your Old Testament, you know that's what the question is. It provides a necessary complement. In the Old Testament, you've got some major themes and some minor themes. It tries to lay the foundation. The New Testament takes those same themes and reverses them. It figures, it figures that we now have this point, and so we don't have to hammer it again. We can build on it. So, for instance, the Old Testament teaches us about a God who is absolutely other than this world. He's transcendent. He's not part of this world. About a God who is absolutely holy, different in character from anything we know, just working from the world up. About a God who is just. This is a cause and effect world. About a God who expects us to be righteous in regard to one another. About a God who is known in community. Every pastor knows there are churches going to heaven together, and there are churches going to hell together. We're either saved together or we're not saved. And that it is in time and space that God has made himself known. Those are the main themes of the Old Testament. Now there's some minor themes. And the transcendent God is immediately present here. The holy God loves his people endlessly. The God of justice is a God who is more than willing to give mercy. The God of social righteousness can be known by individuals, can be experienced in personal righteousness. I don't lie. I keep faith. I don't steal. We can know him personally. You can't read the Psalms without knowing that's true. And revelation comes through teaching, through the Word. But those are minor themes. The major themes you're hammering on, God is other than this world. God's character is other than any character we know from this world. God is just. It is in social righteousness we live it out. It's in community that we know God. And it's through revelation in time and space. Now, if you only read your Old Testament, you might miss the minor themes. So along comes the New Testament. And here, the major themes are what were minor in the Old. And the minor themes are what were major in the Old. Who is this Jesus Christ who comes to be the face of God in my life? Oh, he's the transcendent Father. Jesus is the sent one. The New Testament assumes that we got the point from the Old, and so it doesn't have to restate that stuff. Oh, and it's there. If you're aware, if you've got your eyes open, you know that those minor themes are there. For instance, Paul says, how in the world can you Christians think that you're not part of each other? Can the eye say to the little toe, I don't need you? Well, of course not. But it's so easy to miss it if you don't know your Old Testament. You see, I am saved by myself in my closet. Too bad, the rest of you people. Not possible if you know your Old Testament. But what happens if you don't know your Old Testament? You don't see the minor themes. And you've got a little friendly God who lives under your bed to make all your prayers come true. You've got a blind grandpa in the sky who says, oh, that's all right, Sonny. I didn't see what you did anyhow. Our righteousness is for ourselves. I was the holiest man you ever saw, and then we had children. And I discovered the truth of Wesley's words. There is no holiness except social holiness. That is, holiness lived out with other people, especially your kids. An individualistic, personalistic, privatistic, self-serving religion that is based on nice teachings. Because, of course, people don't rise from the dead. Something that looks an awful lot like modern American evangelical Christianity. Thin as ditch water. Do we need the Old Testament? Oh, how desperately we need the Old Testament. I say again to you, the Old Testament by itself is incomplete. It does not answer all the questions it raises. It is in the New Testament that the questions are answered. But what are the questions? If you don't know the questions, then you will probably misunderstand the answers. Why did Jesus die? So I could go to heaven. No. Jesus died so that we could share the character of God now and evermore. We need the Old Testament. How much more time we got, Gary? All right. Now you've got questions. Several years ago, a lecturer was speaking at one of the schools where I was teaching, and after he finished, he said, I can answer any question. And I thought, well, touch me. Yes, no, or I don't know. And I thought, I can do that well. So, do you have questions? Do you have the courage to ask a question? I know you've got questions. Anyone? I haven't answered them all. I know that. I've raised a lot of them. Yes? Okay. We are saved in community with each other. And what I mean by that, I go into churches where the people don't like each other. The service is over and they're out of there. They are going to heaven by themselves, they think. I go into other churches, like this one, where there is a spirit of love and of caring, where we're helping one another along the road. One falls, and there's a host around to help them up and go on. In the other kind of church, one falls, and it's na 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 na. Does that help? Thank you. Another question. Don't be shy. Okay, you may want to talk to me privately, and I'd love to do that. God bless you. Thanks for listening.